The stream meeting is streaming live.
Got it.
It's live on YouTube, it says.
Yeah,
Yep.
hold on. Yeah,
You're live.
yeah. Hold
See,
on.
now you can host it all the time, Coach K.
Hold on. Yes, and we need to make a volume 0. Okay. Yeah, we're on.
All right.
And hold on.
Coach,
I want one more
Coach
thing.
K and Darlene are hosting.
To send it.
John and Jody are leading.
Yeah. Hold on.
The cat's gotten bigger.
Oh, you see him? Yes.
Yep.
Like 9.4 pounds.
Mm.
Our dog's so small, it's only twice that much.
Your dog?
Yeah, he's 20
I
pounds.
hope this one will.
Oh, that's not very much for, I thought you had a large dog. Is it like a medium size?
No, medium.
Terrier.
Oh, you have a terrier.
I hope this was okay. All right.
I think you're live on YouTube, Coach K. You ready
Yeah,
to
no
start?
problem.
He sends out the notification.
Oh, the notification. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is February 5, 2022. Happy Sabbath.
Happy
John and
Sabbath.
Jody leading Sabbath School, and Kosuke and Darlene are hosting the live stream on YouTube, I guess.
I hope people are watching or can watch this one. I hope I didn't mess up.
This is live.
Yeah, hopefully we don't mess it up. Do we have to redo it if we mess it up?
Did you send out the notification thing, Kosuke?
I don't know. I sent it Eliza, but
Oh, you
Okay.
sent, okay, all
I
right.
think that's fine. Yeah, I think she got it.
On it.
Yep.
It's 9:30. It's Eastside SDA Fellowship Sabbath School. We're going through the Conflict of the Ages series, and we are with Prophets and Kings. Just started this book this year, actually, and we're on chapter 6, which is the rending of the kingdom, which this book starts with Solomon. So the last year we went all the way up and through David's life. Solomon's obviously David's son. And the last 5 chapters have talked about Solomon and the highs and lows of his reign of Israel. And then I guess in a lot of ways, like all good things, at some point they come to an end. And this is the chapter kind of talks about how things ended with them. Let's bow our heads. We'll say a prayer real quick. And then what I want to do is summarize this story. And then there's some questions out there and there'll be some discussion. So let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your Sabbath. Thank you for these words that you've given us to show us what you've done in the past and how you've led. And thank you for sending your son to be with us, to show us who you are, and to let us know that you are still with us and you are still leading, even during these crazy times that we're dealing with. Bless us with this discussion. Fill us with your spirit and lead and guide us in your name. Amen.
Yeah.
So yeah, crazy times. I was telling Kosuke and Darlene that my hospital I work out of, Swedish, has been shut down because of COVID, more or less, this last month, and they're finally opening up. And so
Well, not the
the
hospital.
4th wave, not
Surgical.
shut down, just the surgery, any minor surgery or any non-emergency or non-cancer surgery has been shut down. So it's been the 4th time this has happened, and who knows with COVID what's going to happen again. And COVID did finally hit the Griffin home with Jamie getting it 2 weeks ago. And she's finally better and back at school. Jamie's my daughter. And it was stressful. I told Jody that it was inevitable that she and I would get it. And I'm really surprised that we didn't. We were testing every day. We never got symptoms and we never got COVID that we, at least this round. So
Wow.
all right. So quick summary of this chapter. it's so Solomon, the chapter starts with Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. So Solomon has passed away, and Rehoboam has been tapped as the next ruler of Israel, the whole nation of Israel. And he basically decides he's going to do his inauguration, so to speak, in the city of Shechem. And this guy, Jeroboam, shows up. I did a little research on Jeroboam. Well, I didn't do any research. What I did is I read the two sections in the Bible that discuss this area. And so just for your information, that is Kings, First Kings, about halfway through chapter 11 is where this story can be found in the Old Testament. And the next place in the Bible, which is interesting, is in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 10. And it's almost word for word if you actually read it. It was interesting. I did that last night just to fill in any gaps. But there were a little bit of some differences. And in 1 Kings 11, and Ellen White doesn't get into this in this chapter, so I'll just read it real quick. But basically, 1 Kings 11, verse 27, it says, Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. So that was kind of interesting because I just assumed with David that there wouldn't be any gaps in the wall and that the kingdom would be all taken care of. And apparently it wasn't. And Solomon actually filled this gap. But then it says, now Jeroboam was a man of standing. And when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. And then this gets back to what Ellen was talking about. But it's interesting because Solomon's filling in this gap in the wall, and there's this young man that was doing above average work, even excellent work. And Solomon recognized that and basically promoted him. He was, became in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Israel. And I think this becomes important because Rehoboam goes to Shechem, and all of a sudden Jeroboam represents the labor force and goes to Shechem. And what he wants to know from Rehoboam is, are you going to be as hard on the people you rule as your father was? And it turns out that Solomon, for all the good he did, one of the bad things he did was to be very hard on the Israelites in not only taxes, and I'm assuming that's monetarily, but also in the physical labor to get the things done that he needed to do, which included not only his palace, but the temple. And then you see him, filling in gaps in walls and things like that. So Jeroboam's representing a lot of these people that aren't totally happy, and there's a change in the king. And so the question is, are you going to continue to do what your father did, or are you going to give us a break? Just put it roughly. And I think Rehoboam shows a little bit of wisdom. He says, well, give me 3 days. And he talks to the advisors that Solomon had used. So these presumably older, and that's the word the Bible uses, people, advisors. And these people say, yeah, you should. Well, they don't say you should. They say, if you give these people a break, they will continue to serve you. But then Rehoboam then talks to his friends, it sounds like, these advisors that are younger men and presumably men he grew up with. And they said just the opposite, basically. They said, no, if Solomon was hard, you need to let them know you're even harder on them. And they use this interesting wording, which we can talk about a little bit later. And so Rehoboam's got 3 days to talk to these people and think about it. And then they all get back together in Shechem again. And then Rehoboam makes his decision. And that is, he's going in a lot of ways with his pride and ego, and he wants to be everything his father was and even more. And surprise, surprise, Jeroboam says, well, we're out of here. I mean, and God had sent a prophet to Jeroboam to tell him, you're going to get 10 of the tribes. So in some ways, Jeroboam knew what was going on anyway. And there's a little bit of some power moves going on. And it would be curious if Rehoboam had made a different decision. It sounds like according to the visors, things would have been better. And it sounds like maybe that's what God wanted as well. And we'll discuss that a little bit more. But ultimately what happens is Jeroboam leaves with the 10 tribes. Rehoboam all of a sudden realizes, I'm the king of only 20% or less of what my father was. And then initially sends out this guy named Adoram, I think is his name. And I think this is really eye-opening because I think he thought he could negotiate it, but there was really no turning back. And to the point where they stoned this guy Adoram. And that's when all of a sudden Rehoboam realized this is real. And then he does the next thing, I guess a king would do, and that's to get all his troops together and we're going to take it by force. But then the prophet shows up and says, no, this is my doing. And it's curious because it doesn't sound like it's necessarily Rehoboam that backs down. It's all the people, this 160,000 people, they all went home. And so Rehoboam is left with, the decisions that he's made. And for 3 years continues to lead Israel, very similar to the way David and Solomon did it, and is blessed by God. But then things start to fall apart. And by 5 years, he has gone the way of so many people to follow him. And that is without God, and loses that blessing and ultimately ends up losing the kingdom. And then this is a pattern that you'll see over and over as kings come and go. And this kind of introduces the prophets, some of the major prophets, some of the minor prophets that are trying to help people to lead. So I think that's a fairly safe summary of this chapter. The one thing that was interesting that I didn't mention is that Rehoboam's mom was actually an Ammonite. And so Rehoboam himself is really, only half Jewish and half Ammonite. And and Ellen White puts a lot on that, maybe it was his character that was flawed, and also mentions that maybe it was his upbringing that was flawed because Solomon was so busy. It most certainly was probably a combination of the two. But that was just an interesting thing that I came up with, that I ran across that I hadn't realized. So let's do what our pastor does. Sam, does anyone have any, first impressions on their reading of this chapter? Chapter 6, Prophets and Kings, the rending of the kingdom. And then we'll get into our questions.
So you're asking that the first impressions?
Yeah, what are your first impressions? Anything jump out at you?
Well, I mean that the Jeroboam has an opportunity to rule well, right? I mean that as a prophet, that is it who is appeared to him? I forgot the name. It's just whoever. Yeah. So told him that if you rule obeying that the God's words, and just like as a David, then that your family will be established firm, and I'll be with you. Actually, that God is also explained the reason why that Rehoboam. Sorry, that I'm reading the Japanese Bible, so sometimes it's pronouncing is different. Rehoboam, Rehoboam, that Yaberam, that Jeroboam, in Japanese it's Yaberam, Jeroboam. Jeroboam was told by God that because that Rehoboam that disobeyed, I'm splitting that, and Solomon, disobeyed. So I'm splitting that the kingdoms into two, and I'll give you 10. So there was a clear explanation by God why he's doing this, right? It's Jeroboam should know God is doing this, but yet because that he wanted to have people's loyalty, and Jerusalem is in the middle of the Judah, right? So he actually forced the people to start worshiping the golden calves. So that's sad that he did that, honestly speaking. I mean, that he knew that the God is arranging this, but yet that he couldn't obey. So that was a kind
Jeroboam did it? Or
Yeah,
Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. I mean, we're starting to get into the next chapter,
Okay.
Which is chapter 7, and it's entitled Jeroboam.
Right.
That's ultimately what he ends up doing. He gets the 10 kingdoms,
Right.
and he establishes rulership of the 10 kingdoms as directed by God through the prophet. And then he gets really insecure. He's like, well, I have these kingdom, these 10 tribes as part of my kingdom, but I don't have Jerusalem where the temple is, and that's where everyone worships God.
Right.
And I'm going to lose everyone to Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And so that's where he establishes these two idols.
Right.
And I think there are 2 calves that were worshipped, although there was one area that mentions it might have been a goat and a sheep. But regardless, he sets up an alternative worship, which ultimately, if I remember right, becomes this kingdom becomes inbred, and that's what ultimately becomes the Samaritans, which are kind of the inbred Jews that worshipped completely separately from the temple. And you see that with Jesus and the woman at the well, and they have this discussion. But this is where that started. I mean, the kingdom went 2 different directions.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the map, because I was curious, and I pulled up the map because a little later in the chapter they talk about how Rehoboam has basically Judah and Benjamin. And if I remember correctly, David came from the tribe of Benjamin. And so they have those 2 tribes.
Saul is from Benjamin.
Oh, that's right. So Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin, and David's from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
But Jerusalem is in Benjamin. So land of the 12 tribes. So you see Jerusalem is right next to the Salt Sea with Bethlehem below it. But Jerusalem's in Benjamin. And then Judah is the rest of the territory, and it's all there's almost a line straight across the top of the Salt Sea and then down. But the interesting thing I didn't realize was that one of the tribes, Simeon, is totally landlocked in the middle of Judah.
Right.
And I thought that was curious, because technically that was under Jeroboam's reign, and so not only is the kingdom divided, it's somewhat infiltrated. So I mean, it was just an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think Simeon that basically they were kind of cursed, because of what he did to Joseph, and
right.
I think that Jacob kind of gave them the tribe curse, and they didn't get the good land, and eventually the Simeon moved to north. Actually, I think to some part is the north. I think. Yeah.
And that might explain the question I had is, how did that all work with Rehoboam being in charge of the south and Jeroboam being in charge of the north? Right. This gets really confusing. I'm sorry. Kosuke's struggling with English and Japanese because he's reading the account in Japanese.
That's easier for me.
The names are similar. So there's Rehoboam, which is who we're talking about. That's Solomon says. There's Jeroboam, who is the one that takes over the northern 10 tribes. But I remember reading through the Old Testament, and these kings, they come and go, and the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, document these comings and goings, but they're constantly switching between Israel, which is ultimately the northern part, and Judah, which is the southern part,
Right.
And honestly, I don't think I totally got it the first time I went through, and it took a couple reads before you had to start really differentiating one over the other. And so try to keep that in your mind as you're going through this. Anyway, any initial thoughts, Dee?
Well, the part where Rehoboam rejects the elders' counsel and accepts his friends, and I was thinking, oh, it will never work out when a leader decides to be controlled or led out by his own ego and pride. It's just bad, and right then and there, you just know this is never going to work out. And I don't know if Rehoboam already knew that the kingdom was to be divided, because Solomon knew, right? I don't know if Solomon told him. Did he know, honey?
I think he knew.
And
I
yet
think he knew.
he didn't even think about it. Like, he didn't think that how he could possibly, stop that from happening and actually keep the tribes united.
Yeah.
He just like ran with it, and just his whole entire ego just drove to that decision, and it's sad.
Right.
I don't know if I think it's a combination of maybe age, his young age, and just the fact that how he grew up and how he had already lived his life. Maybe. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. So Jody does not like the question. What were your first thoughts?
Oh, it's okay. I'll respond. So along the same,
I was giving you an out.
I know you were. Along the same lines, though, he had a lot of potential of what he could have done. But I do think he relied, apparently he didn't want to go with the older advice. He relied on his own, I guess, contemporaries or something for his advice. And plus he was like, I think Darlene's right about his ego. He was totally led astray as far as like wanting, then he got kind of into idolatry, and he was just, instead of this great potential, he would just blew it basically. So that was like, those are my first impressions.
So, and that leads us, well, before we leave your first impressions, Jody somewhere either heard or read about family-run businesses and how a lot of the times it's a father that takes it from the ground up and gets it successful, and a son that comes, or daughter, a family member that keeps it going. But then by the third generation, often these companies lose their ability to continue to be successful.
Oh.
So explain that a little bit more, because I'm
So,
only paraphrasing what you told me and you heard it originally.
basically, like, by the third generation. So if I don't care if you use my family's situation or John's family situation, but that's just, or friends that we've observed too. But, like in the case of, say, my grandparents, they were farmers in Idaho, and they, sacrificed a lot to buy what they had. They worked hard their entire life for the sake of the farm. And then by the second generation, meaning my mom and my uncle, they were all part of that. They saw how hard they worked. And then by the third generation, my generation, I don't know anything about farming, quite honestly. And I don't have any inheritance in it, so that's a moot point. But, it turns out in our case, my cousin did grow up on the farm, he knows. But then by the time you get to his son, he has no idea how hard my grandparents worked, and that's the same thing. John's family has a business, and his mom and dad like worked very hard to get it established. John understands it, but our kids don't have a clue as to how hard, because they weren't around in its beginnings, and they don't have a clue as to how hard, they worked. And so it kind of parallels, like, at some point it loses its effectiveness. Like they don't see the original goals or whatever as the beginning. And I think sometimes when you get this line of succession, like we see in the Bible, it's kind of similar too, because you don't see what previous has done. You see what's done ahead of you to a certain degree, but maybe you don't appreciate the hard work and what was done, and maybe think that like what decisions were made, way back when or whatever, were maybe the wrong decisions or whatever. I don't know. You have that hindsight, which is a luxury, but at the same time, maybe not a strong appreciation for what was already done. And you kind of see that in the line of Kings too, as successors come in, maybe they don't have that same appreciation.
And it made me think of this because, you see David, who literally was a shepherd, had nothing, and battled his way, with God working through him, no question, and making mistakes. I mean, David made mistakes, but was always coming back to God. And, David ultimately wanted to build the temple, wasn't able to because of all the bloodshed. And Solomon, you see him working at building his palace, building the temple, and making, Israel so successful that they had a very strong influence on the surrounding nations. Right. And in a lot of ways, Solomon's failure was not coming to God and being influenced by the surrounding nations. And then all of a sudden, the son Rehoboam comes along, who presumably doesn't know David. I don't know. But certainly doesn't see all the work that went into this. And he has as close to the perfect kingdom as possible to set up and go. But I think the turning point for him was this decision. How are you going to treat the people you're reigning over? So that kind of gets us to the first question. And so it's up there on your chat area. And if there's people on, if there's people on the line and you want to comment, just comment through the chat. But the first question is, what kind of mentors have been important in your life for both big decisions and small decisions? And this is Rehoboam. I think he wisely goes to Solomon's advisors. And honestly, I think wisely goes to the younger men, his generation, and women, to make a decision. And he gives himself 3 days, which isn't a bad time. But then the rest of the question is, do you mentor up? And by that, I mean, mentors in your life, are they older than you, or do you mentor down? Are they younger than you? Hopefully, honestly, it's a combination of the two. But then the rest of the question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of both? And a lot of this question is directed to ourselves, but I think we can also see advantages and disadvantages with what Rehoboam was experiencing. So I don't know, Kosuke, who do you see as mentors in your life? Do they tend to be mentoring up or mentoring down?
Yeah, interesting. So I mean that Japanese seniority system. So when you say mentor, should be older, right? Yeah. Age-wise. I mean that. So normally older people. I don't think that I had a mentors younger one, but I mean, I'm not against it. Actually, there are lots of smart young people, even that 20s, and I can learn a lot. All the those entrepreneurs and new innovative thinkers are young people, right? So there are lots of young people who are top in corporations and running the companies in the society. That's a good thing. in my life that I had several mentors in a sense that, but I was not a good listener. I'm more rebellious. That's my program. I will tell you seriously. I mean that if I'm smarter and wiser and listening to other, wise people, my life will be much different. Honestly speaking, when I was a high school, that I had the person that who actually it's a kind of a tutor. Okay, so to pass that college exam, national exam. But he was also the scholar, and he was with one of the top school actually in Japan.
Wow.
Yeah, it's called Kyoto University. It's a kind of like Stanford, Harvard, either of which case that in Japan. And I eventually went to the same school actually. But the thing is, so he tried to raise me as an economist. So I was in high school preparing for the college exam. I'm studying that Samuelson's, the Paul Samuelson, which is a famous economist. He's a Nobel Prize, economist, and I was reading his book actually in high school to be an economist actually. But didn't turn out well because I went into the school. But after I went into school, I totally, gave up that kind of a desire. Did whatever I want and
Play too much.
Yeah, play too much. And, failed the exam to go to the graduate school and went to business. So I was not a smart kid in that sense. I wish that I have a more wider visions and good listeners. I think that's a condition of the wise people. So yeah.
All right, D.
In my life, the only person that I could really identify as who's been my mentor, and it wasn't where she said to me, "I'll be your mentor," but it just naturally happened because, when I became a director of nursing, she used to be in that position until she got promoted. So it was natural that she would mentor me through, especially the first few years. And I'm the kind of person, I think opposite of him, I really listen. I mean, I literally listen and see everything that goes around. And I tell this to my kids all the time, that you want to keep your eyes and ears open to anything that is around you, anywhere, especially a workplace, because that's how you learn. And it doesn't even matter if that has whatever discussion is going on, even if it doesn't have nothing to do with your current job, you still listen, because in some time down the road, it is going to make all sense and it's going to just help you, So that's how I learned. I just watched her and just listened to everything she had to say, and I took it all in, and I basically made it into my own and expanded on it and grew with it. You know what I mean? So in that sense, she was a mentor to me. And then, of course, as a director of nursing, you do mentor, but it's more of like a support guide, that kind of stuff. But in the last two jobs, more as a divisional director level, then you really do get to mentor people. That's one of your job descriptions, to mentor and really to train. And, I think this mentoring up or down, it was important for me to really listen and also learn from the people that I'm mentoring too, because regardless of where you've been in your career or your age, I always thought that everyone can bring something to the table. Mm-hmm. And of course, the older, more experienced, they bring all that with you, right? Oh my gosh, how wonderful is that, right? All that experience that you don't get from a book, right? You're not going to get that from a book. And then the younger people, yes, they have more. What they bring is the more current book knowledge, plus just advancement in technology and all that kind of stuff, And then they also bring all these new ideas that maybe in our generation and the older generation didn't really think about, didn't have. So even though I thought that I was mentoring, there were still definitely things that I learned. And I think it goes both ways. I think it's a respect thing. I think that goes both ways.
Joey?
Hmm. I mean, I think obviously I've had mentors in my life, teachers and parents and aunts and uncles. And, I think all of those fall under that. Grandparents all fall under that category. I did have the privilege of working with this math teacher, my first job out of college. And I wouldn't say he mentored me about teaching, but he mentored me more about life. He kept, when I signed on there, I was 23 years old, I think. And he was not quite nearing retirement, but getting closer, I think. And, basically he would give me life advice about finances more than anything else. Because it was my first paycheck, then he was advising me. He's a math person and very into numbers, and was advising me to, be cautious in how to spend my money, I guess, or not to spend my money, I think was more the advice he was giving me. And honestly, there wasn't a lot to spend. So obviously I needed to listen to him, and I did, almost a little bit more than my parents even. But then I think about other mentors, and I'm a little bit Kosuke-like, in that I remember growing up, obviously every pastor was older than I am, but I remember there was a point, and then there was a point in our lives where the pastor was the same age as we were. And then the next pastor came along that was younger. And I remember like, what does this guy have to?
And now we're some of the oldest people in the church.
And now, like on the older end. But I remember being a little bit hesitant, like, what is this guy like? I don't know if I can respect his leadership. And like, I don't know. And so I think as I've gone on, I've had to like, obviously that was in a church situation, but then, at work and whatnot, truly we are getting to be on the older end. And it's like, I like it when they refer to us as a mature staff. I'm like, that is just wrong. Like, don't say that. They're like, well, you're not young. I'm like, But yeah, I mean, mentoring, to other younger people, they do bring a lot of enthusiasm and new ideas and energy, which is great. And at first, sometimes as an older person, I think there was the gentleman who was actually at my first job again. He was friends with my mom's cousin, basically, and worked at the same campus that I did. And I met him, and he said to me, "You're fresh out of college. We've tried everything new. We've done everything new. Don't give us a bunch of your new ideas and try to derail us." And I was like, what is that? And honestly, he was the only Adventist that worked at the same school that I did. And I was just really turned off with the whole thing. I was like, okay. So I think I've made a conscientious effort to not like squash new enthusiasm like that. Cause I was just like, what? Like, I wasn't coming in here to tell you how to do things. It's like, that was my introduction to the guy. I never said anything, or honestly, I was too scared to come up with a bunch of new ideas. So I guess I like to be cautious with people younger than me, but I do think I have learned to listen to younger people compared to maybe what I was, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe. Is that fair?
Or 20,
20?
25.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it got me thinking a bit, because there's certainly, when you're growing up, you have your parents. When you're in school, you have your teachers. When you're starting jobs, you have your boss. And I remember being in residency in general surgery, And I remember them talking about a specific anesthesiologist. And it was kind of the guy you didn't want to be. He hated his job. And you could tell by the way he took care of the patients. And I remember saying, I would never consider that person an example to follow. And the anesthesiologist that was in the room, that wasn't the same guy, obviously, he's like, John, you're always an example. And he says, in this case, it's just an example of what you don't want to be and what you don't want to do. And that really made a big impression on me. I wouldn't even consider this guy a mentor. It was just a guy I was with. He said something that I remember. And I think you are always an example. I don't think you always are a mentor. And a mentor is kind of another step. And that's a trusted person that has an opinion that has more weight than just everyone else out there. Because you can certainly ask anyone and everyone. And you're going to get a little bit of everything when you do, but you have to have some people you can go to. And I've had a few people that I would consider true mentors, that if I have a big decision in life, then I go to them. And it's interesting, when I started practice as a colon and rectal surgeon in Salt Lake City, there was this older guy, and we eventually became friends. And through the good and the bad, he ended up being kind of that guy I went to. And a lot of it was just because of his experience. He'd been around, seemed like forever, and he had good advice based on his experience. He also knew how things worked, in the hospital and those systems, and was able to help me navigate through those systems, successfully. And that was me young. And I think when you're young, you do look up to people, and you do see people you want to be like. I think as you get older, you still do that. You have to some degree. But at the same time, I think you have at least somewhat of an obligation to pay it back to younger people. And I think you can see someone that's young that needs help, and you can approach them. I don't think you can become a mentor for them unless they accept you in that role. And it's a great thing if you can get that to happen. And the interesting thing is, when I finished up in Salt Lake City and eventually came to Seattle, one of our previous residents was my partner. And one of the few people I would have accepted as a partner. And I had a lot of respect for him. He was an Adventist guy, actually. And still practices, and it still is someone that I'll call when I have decisions that I need to make and I'm just not sure, which direction to go, because the people older than me are fewer and farther between, partly. But again, he's younger. He knows the systems. He's had to navigate through them as well. And it's just someone to help guide you, make sure you're thinking straight with the big decisions you're making. And this is what, Rehoboam, this is a huge responsibility. I mean, you see Solomon with this huge responsibility while David, his father, was still alive, coming to God and asking him for wisdom. And this happens at least twice, and presumably at least one of the times was with David still alive. And then he does it again. And all of a sudden, Solomon is dead, and his son is taking over. And I guess Rehoboam had to know that Solomon had gone to the Lord, and the Lord had blessed him with wisdom, and then everything that followed. And so, I guess I wished he would have done that. And, who knows what he did that wasn't written down. But I think he did the right thing by mentoring up and mentoring down. These are advisors, people that give him advice. But again, I think it was pride and ego. And it's almost like kids. I mean, they talk about the young men and their response to him. And they're like, tell them that your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter, is what they were asking. And then the friends are like, your response should be, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. And, my father laid a heavy yoke on you. I will make it even heavier. And, you were scourged. I won't just scourge you with whips, I'll scourge you with scorpions. I mean, it's kind of like, who even talks like that? And you get this picture of a kid that grew up in a privileged life with friends that grew up in a privileged life. And they kind of, what would you do if you were king? And it's almost kids talk that comes back. And then all of a sudden he loses 10 of the tribes and then decides, well, I'll send an advisor out. And that guy gets stoned to death. And now he's responsible for his first death under his rulership. And, it's really eye-opening. And so this kind of leads into, the next question. Rehoboam had an opportunity and he made some decisions that changed the course of things for him. And it says, what opportunities in your life have you taken advantage of? Obviously, when opportunity comes, you can take it or you can leave it. And what opportunities have you not taken advantage of? And then this, I want to finish with Rehoboam, but then I want to open it up to us just to see what comes out of it. But can you look back and see God working in either of these scenarios? It's interesting that even though Rehoboam made the decision he made and walked away from an opportunity that could have potentially kept things going for him, at least according to what the older advisors said, and honestly, according to what Ellen White said, it's almost like God did not like what Solomon was doing and wanted Israel to have a little bit more equality. So not a big difference between rulership and the people that were being ruled. I haven't been able to completely wrap my mind around it. Because a lot of this was God-led, and it's almost like if Rehoboam had gone with what the older people had said, that the kingdom would have stuck together, but I don't know if that would have been against God's will or if God would have changed his mind, because you do see God changing his mind later on when the king of Egypt comes along to wipe him out, and all of a sudden, the people humble themselves. I don't know whether Rehoboam did, and I had some thoughts on that, but it's interesting. There's this opportunity, and Ellen White almost hints that, the first 3 years, Rehoboam does kind of follow in his father and his grandfather's footsteps. And Ellen White, if not overtly, at least, somewhat implies that if he had continued to let the Lord lead and be the controlling influence in his life, that the other tribes would have come back to him, is almost what it sounded like to me, or at least they would have had a better relationship. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on that when you read through it?
Yeah, so you're talking about how things could be different.
Yeah, I mean, could things have played out different? It was God's will, and it didn't matter how it happened. It just needed to happen.
Right. I think that's a pretty difficult question, because it's a kind of the answer belongs to God.
Oh yeah,
right.
I get that.
Yeah, and there is an interpretation that with the Bible that in a way that God knew from the Alpha to Omega, and he knew the result, but yet that the decision is up to the people. In that way, that God can tell future to some extent. But there are the belief that some people believe that God knows to some extent, not fully, so that God's knowledge is depending also on the people's decision. And if you read the part that you are talking about, how God changed the mind after Rehoboam's 3 years rule, sounds like, and the same situation happens in Moses too, right? That during the Exodus, when the people, did a golden calf, and God said that I will start a new family from you, and let me, perish these people, the rebellious people. And God changed the mind after Moses flee. And so reading that looks like that God is actually changing his mind depending on how people behave. I think that that's ultimately that God only knows, and we probably
Right.
know later. But I think it's more, my understanding is God knows Alpha to Omega.
Yeah.
Although that we decide, even that our decisions God foresee, yet God can give us a chance and also opportunities to do better.
Right.
Definitely, every one of us, and Rehoboam and Jeroboam had the opportunities and the different way of life if they are obedient to the end, right? And never
Right.
know that was that and it was an option. Everybody has an option. Everybody has a freedom. But he didn't take that route, unfortunately. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. God knows the beginning from the end, and he honestly knows better than we know. And the other quote I really liked, and I almost wanted to start with this quote, but it's on page 97, that first full sentence. It says, "The rending of the kingdom was but the beginning of a wonderful history, wherein are revealed the long suffering and tender mercy of God." And I mean, you think about it, and this is the beginning of some of the worst times in Israel. Although before Saul and David and Solomon, it was pretty rough. So I mean, Israel, and then there's Egypt. But it says it's the beginning of a wonderful history. And I think through good times and bad times, you can look back and see God working in other people's lives. You can see him working in our lives. I mean, and I've talked about this before where, I left a partnership in Salt Lake and things got really bad, and I knew what I wanted to have work out. And honestly, the rough times that it was brought us closer to God. And in retrospect, you look back and God had a much better plan than we ever had. I knew that I wanted to get from point A to point B, and I knew roughly there were options, but the way God took us through was infinitely better than anything we could have done on our own. And I'm grateful to that. And I think it's made us stronger people. And often it's easier to do that with bigger decisions and bigger problems. And sometimes the smaller decisions and smaller problems is where, we let things lead us astray, honestly. In the interest of time, I have one comment, and it is that God can change his mind. And so I do believe things could have been different if Rehoboam had gone with the older mentors and continued to follow God, as opposed to the younger mentors and continue to follow God. And by all accounts, he did okay for that first 3 years, but then his pride and ego got in the way. Ellen White kind of blames it on him being an Ammonite to some degree. I don't think that's necessarily fair. But it always struck me as odd, the part of the story about the shields. And apparently Solomon had made these gold shields that the soldiers had used.
Right.
And in both accounts, in Kings and in Chronicles, they talk about these shields. And I'm just like, okay, I get, the Egyptian king, and I forget his name, Shishak, I think, or something like that.
Mhm.
He comes and he's going to wipe out Jerusalem. And he'd already wiped out these 15 cities that Rehoboam had fortified. And so he's quite capable. But then the people humble themselves. I think that the people did humble themselves because I think they had a better insight of God and what God had done to them than Rehoboam had. I think the shields had to do with humbling, God working through Shishak and humbling Rehoboam, because the king came in and took a lot, if not all, of the treasures out of the palace and the temple. But I think the shields were very symbolic of how well Israel had become, through David and Solomon's reign. And Shishak walks out with these, and it humbles Rehoboam to the point where his pride and ego is still part of it. And he has them make bronze shields to kind of, show that he's still in control, and things are still kind of the way they used to be, even though everyone can really tell that they aren't. Anyway, that was just a thought I had on that. And we have about 5-10 minutes left, and I don't want to not make it through all these questions. So the last question is what I just said. Okay, so I led into this. The third question is how the rending of the kingdom was but the beginning of a wonderful history. How was this true for Israel in the past, and how is it true for us today and in the future?
Rending means that the splitting, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
like rending a garment.
Mhm.
Which is interesting because if you read about Jeroboam, the prophet that told him this was going to happen had a new coat on. And his way of telling Jeroboam he was going to get it was he tore his new coat into 10 pieces.
Mhm.
An initial rending, symbolic of what was going to happen. And he had Jeroboam pick 10 pieces, and he told him those are going to be the 10 tribes that you take.
It's interesting to me because when I think of is the rending of the kingdom was the beginning of a wonderful history. When we usually think of something breaking apart, we usually think of it as having negative connotations.
An ending.
Yeah, the
something.
ending of an era or something that has been profitable or good or beneficial in some way. So when we think about when we think in our past, history of churches and how, churches broke off and stuff like that. Initially, was that thought of as a good thing or as a negative thing? I don't know. And I think of even today, and in the future, when we think of if something were to, to change in a drastic way, oftentimes those ones who are breaking off view it as a positive, but I'm not sure if that's always thought of as the people who want to hold on to what was.
And it's interesting because you're talking about churches breaking off, and the Adventist church is very much one of the Protestant religions that has broken off from a number of churches, but also a coming back together of, at least what the founders of the church considered to be the truth that came out of the Bible.
But go ahead.
The Israel, once again, after this time went through, many cycles of, being, captivity as slaves and, having all their just this wonderfulness, the blessings from God all gone. Yet I think the fact that this was a beginning of a wonderful history, which really doesn't sound right, but yet it was, in that even because again, over and over again, we see in the history that even through all the apostasy and just turning away from God, the Israelites, right? God never forsaken them. He's never forsaken, right? And yes, he became angry and he sent things to punish them, but even within that punishment, his goal wasn't to, it wasn't out of malice, but it was out of his love, right? So that the people will wake up and once again be able to turn their heart back to God. So in that sense, I guess that we, in our present time, as reading these stories, we see that we can understand that that's how God is working in our own life as well, that even through our own struggles and difficult times, that when we actually really kind of slow down and kind of take ourselves a bit out of all that pain or struggles, and really be able to see and that God, and then especially when you look backwards, right, you can see that God has been there all the time. And in fact, you are even more blessed now than you had been in that, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or whatever.
Yeah, I think Dee, you are looking back, and I like what you had to say, that God has been there all the time, and sometimes without us consciously even knowing that. I think for me, I was looking forward, and you have this pattern that Israel develops where some kings bring them closer to God and helps the kingdoms around to come closer to God. Some kings led them completely in the opposite direction. And we're going to get into that in this chapter. But sooner or later, it was a constant decline, enough so that down the road, God has Israel completely taken out of Jerusalem. The palace and the temple are abandoned. The whole city is abandoned, except for just a small remnant. And they all end up in Babylon, where there is another beginning, and that's more prophecy from all the different prophets of a Messiah that will come and be with you. And ultimately, they get back out of Babylon and in Jerusalem. And then Israel, in a lot of ways, goes a completely different direction. Instead of the apostasy of the surrounding neighbors, it became a self-centered idolatry of salvation by works in a lot of ways, that was still losing sight of what God really wanted for them. And then Jesus shows up in Israel as a new beginning that is truly a wonderful new beginning, and the beginning of the history for what we as Christians believe for the Christian church. And I can't, there's 2 points. I mean, obviously God is working through the situation there, but I can't help but think that this was not only a turning point for Israel, but it was also a turning point for God. And I go back to, I think I did one of the lessons about the temple in Solomon. And Ellen White makes this interesting statement that the temple could have been potentially left intact and continued forever. And I think that might have been one direction God was hoping to have Israel go. But then the decisions made by Rehoboam changed that direction, and it had to go to through a different process in a different direction to get God's salvation worked out here on earth. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. I think we're kind of out of time. It's an interesting chapter. It does make you think of, who you go to when you have opportunities. What opportunities are worth taking, what opportunities aren't. And I think having your focus on God will help in both those scenarios. But I do believe that God does work with us where we are and continues and leads and guides us. I think I'll say prayer, and then we will be having church at 11:15 in person and online. And so I would invite anyone and everyone to feel free to join us. And I appreciate Kosuke and Darlene helping, and Jody, my wife, helping with this chapter as we go through this book. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your love for us. You're our creator and you're our savior in so many ways. And I want to thank you for this chance to look back at how you worked in David and Solomon and Rehoboam's life. And I want to remember that you are working in our lives today. And I ask that you continue to fill us with your spirit, lead and guide us, and give us the ability to keep our hand in your hand as we navigate the lives we live here on earth. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, John.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, I think you better go to leave.